to discuss docket 0181, message and order approving a home rule petition to the general court entitled "An Act Relative to Surcharges Imposed to Finance the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center." This matter was sponsored by Mayor Walsh, referred to the Committee on Government Operations back on January 25th. And basically, docket 0181 is a home rule petition that would redirect revenue to the city's general fund from two surcharges that are generated from the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center Fund. Under state law, there was a 5% surcharge on the price of sightseeing tours conducted in the city, as well as a $10 surcharge on each rental car transaction in the city. Surcharges are credited to the Convention Center Fund to help pay for costs related to the BCEC, including directing project expenditures and debt service. According to the mayor's transmittal letter, there is a surplus fund each year, which will be able to be used for important city initiatives such as universal pre-kindergarten, pre-K. So docket 0181 would require the state treasurer to segregate the revenues into a separate fund and then distribute to the city on a quarterly basis. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. If my colleague has any opening statement, we can get right into it with the administration. So we're joined here today by Chief Financial Officer Dave Sweeney. He's joined by Chief of Education Ron Dorsey. Okay, and Mary McCoy, Revenue Manager, and just brought to my attention as had referenced that it does require that the state treasurer has to segregate the fund. So we have to be aware of that when this goes up to Beacon Hill. So that said, I'll turn it over to Dave Sweeney for any opening comments and thoughts. I think you guys may have a presentation of some sort.
Yes, thank you, Counselor. Dave Sweeney, I'm Chief Financial Officer for the City of Boston. We have a very brief presentation that I'm going to walk you through, if you allow, and then Ron has some statements to make, providing some context as relative to the overall universal pre-K issue in the city and the work that's been done over the last few years. So this home rule petition would be one component of an education finance reform package that the mayor has put together this legislative session. Multi-pronged approach to comprehensive education finance reform that will allow us to invest equitably in public education and expand access to high quality education for all students. So the combination of the components of the education finance reform bills would free up about $35 million in revenue for the city to reinvest in BPS and other educational settings. This particular piece would accounts for about $16.5 million of that $35 million. Additionally, we have supported legislation filed by Senator Chang Diaz, which is a modification of legislation that was passed in the Senate last session. That'd be more beneficial to Boston than the previous iterations. That legislation would have a monumental impact on the city's finances and BPS, in that it would get us about an additional $150 million per year if a major piece of education finance legislation were to pass. So we've tried to tier our approach in different ways and sort of go after different levels of potential different proposals that have different orders of magnitude in terms of financial impact. So they're generally categorized by this proposal that we're here to speak specifically about today would provide every Boston 4-year-old with a high quality pre-K seat. We have legislation that would fix the broken charter school transition funding model. We would modify the state's circuit breaker reimbursement as well. That would gain the city about $6 million a year in additional revenue that would go directly to Boston Public Schools. And as I referenced, we could make transformational education funding available for Boston if the state identifies a new education revenue source. So as you're all aware, the mayor and city council have been making targeting, and the Boston School Committee have been making targeted investments for a substantial period of time here. I've been here for the last 3 years, and this will be the fourth budget of the mayor's. All of these are aimed at making research-driven, targeted investments to close the achievement gap. We have fully extended the school day to 6.5 hours for kindergarten through 8th grade for 23,000 students, adding 120 hours of learning. That'll be fully implemented, or it is envisioned that that will be fully implemented in next year's BPS budget. We're now serving 725 additional students in high-quality full-day pre-K at BPS and in community-based settings compared to 3 years ago. We've also launched Excellence for All in 13 schools to provide enriching academic experiences to fourth grade students, in addition to the advanced work class that was already in place. We've expanded on the early hiring program to provide school leaders with flexibility to put effective teachers in every classroom, and then sort of outside of BPS, but within the overall city and city-related entity umbrella, for offering tuition-free community college to eligible students from BPS as well. These revenue-related proposals and funding formula-related proposals in some ways grew out of the work done on the BPS long-term financial plan, which members of BPS, other interested groups, and the city worked on. So the plan's major findings can be synthesized into 10 big ideas. Many of them are inward looking and call for reforms to the way that BPS does business in order to get itself on a sustainable financial track. And some of those are already underway. So for instance, this year we've attempted, and this is continuing into the next fiscal year, we've attempted to curb the increasing transportation costs that BPS has experienced over the last several years that diverts funding out of the classrooms and onto the streets. We're also attempting to negotiate a responsible collective bargaining agreement. There have been some central office reforms and reductions in some areas aimed at putting BPS on a stronger track. But the group also found that there was a need to identify additional revenue sources as well, or to make better use of additional state programs by advocating to have funding formulas tailored better toward Boston's needs. I think as everyone here knows, one of the challenges with state funding to Boston traditionally has been that we are forced into funding formulas that are made to fit 351 cities and towns, and sometimes that's to the benefit of Boston, but oftentimes it isn't because we are in a unique situation relative to our peers. So the long-term financial plan identified that state education revenue has been stagnant. Our charter assessments are growing, and even with the failure of question 2 to pass, our charter assessments will continue to rise at a rate much faster than our revenue. So that brought us to these proposals. Just really quickly though, this is an updated version of a slide that I think we've seen in the past that shows how Boston's education spending has gone up in the top line compared to our aid that we're receiving. So just in this very short period of time during a period of economic expansion, the bottom line shows our charter reimbursement has actually declined from $35 million in fiscal year 14 to $21 million in fiscal year 17. At the same time, our charter assessment grew from $110 million to $157 million. So our charter reimbursement has actually declined by 25% during that period. And our Chapter 70 aid has only grown by slightly less than 4% during the period shown on the chart. In contrast to that, education spending continues to rise and has gone up by 18% from fiscal year 14 to where it's projected in fiscal year 18. So that brings us to our desire to invest in early education, and we can speak a little bit more at the end about Well, I'll go into it now. So and Ron can get into the details on the programmatic side, but essentially what this does, as a counselor alluded to at the beginning of the hearing, this redirects two existing surcharges that generate about $16.5 million per year that currently go into the state's convention center fund, a surcharge on vehicles and a sightseeing charge. Redirects that from the convention center back to Boston where it's generated. These two charges are generated exclusively in Boston and none of the other 350 cities and towns, and go into the convention center. And the convention center has recently run a healthy surplus every year, indicating that they do not need $16.5 million currently to operate. In fact, the state has swept surpluses to balance their own budget in recent years, and last year swept $60 million from the convention center fund. And these are funds of which about 85 to 90% are generated in total in Boston, of about $140 million in revenue. So we would be attempting to segment off two of the charges that go into the fund. We believe that this allows the convention center to operate, a board which we sit on and have knowledge of convention center operations. We believe this amount of money is sustainable to be diverted from their fund back to the city's fund in order to carry out the work of the UPK task force and successor organizations and units that may be set up. So with that, I turn it over to Ron to sort of.
I just had a
Go
couple.
ahead.
Today,
Yeah.
we've also been joined by our colleague, City Council Frank Baker and City Council Tim McCarthy. And just a quick question on your presentation there. Are there ebbs and flows in the surplus? So you indicated that there's sort of a roughly 16 million. So say next year it's only 8 million. Say next year it's 40 million. Do we have the discretion, if you will, based on this home rule petition, to either divert additional funds if there's a surplus in other areas, or if there's a sort of a shortage, then what do we do?
Yep. So, so the convention center fund balance, I believe, at the moment it's in the 88 million. So they do have some buffer there. I think the convention center has also begun an initiative to close the gap to make themselves self-sufficient effectively. So they had their most successful year ever in that regard last year and only had a net operating loss of $5 million. So that 88 million could potentially last a long time.
Well, how does that in play? So there was some discussion at one point that the convention center was talking about an expansion.
Yes.
And there may be a concept sort of maybe
Yep.
around sort of campus style, but so does that $88 million surplus, does that go towards sort of funding that, or is it sort of a separate part of
I think it could in theory. I don't think a decision's been made.
Okay.
And not a lot of discussion lately about the status of the expansion, but I should add that we have anticipated in the legislation that if expansion were back on the table, that this funding could revert to the convention center to expand. So I think part of our thinking here is this fund had been earmarked for convention center use for a long period of time with the understanding that a potential expansion was coming. We don't know that that's going to occur at this point in time. If it does occur, then I think we would be fine with, and the law would allow for funds to be used for expansion. But if funds are not necessary for expansion because expansion isn't occurring, then we believe that Boston has a strong claim on this revenue.
Okay. And if we transition to Ron, how many 4-year-olds do we currently have in the city?
To about 2025, that would be 6,000 4-year-olds potentially demanding high-quality K1 seats. Just to get started, Chief Sweeney has described what we think is a creative and workable solution for a very important education investment. I want to give a little bit of background on what we've been working on to improve access to high-quality seats, and I want to underscore high quality. So during the mayor's 2013 campaign, he made it a stated priority to make sure that all 4-year-olds would have access to a high quality seat. One, because the early learning literature tells us that high quality pre-K investments close early racial and class achievement gaps. Secondly, the literature on practice tells us that Boston is doing this work largely because of the efforts of BPS to improve its K-1 program, but we're seeing the replication of that quality through the KIDS initiative, which is a partnership with many of our community providers, as well as through the Pre-K Expansion Grant, which is a federal grant program that Boston and several gateway cities participate in right now, which again brings the Boston Public Schools together with community providers to provide high-quality K-1 seats. So I've been leading a working group for the past several months, probably going on a year now, that is comprised of BPS, the state's Early Education and Care Department, the Children's Museum, community providers, and philanthropy to, first of all, identify the pre-K access and quality gaps. Secondly, to develop some potential strategies to expand access to high-quality seats and to estimate the cost for doing this. A couple of headlines that I want to share with you so that you have an understanding of where Boston is in terms of being able to provide the access that we intend to. First of all, Boston does not have an access problem per se, and I think we just talked about the number of 4-year-olds, but Boston has roughly 7,900 pre-K seats between Boston Public Schools, community providers, Catholic schools, and charter schools. So the supply of seats outstrips the number of 4-year-olds who may be seeking those seats. And so nearly every family that wants a pre-K seat in Boston has access to one. But while we don't face an access challenge, there is a quality gap. And so the number of high-quality pre-K seats in Boston falls short of demand. And when we talk about quality, what we mean is that it is a classroom in a setting that uses a formal curricula, employs BA-level teachers or higher. The program is accredited or it meets the state's QRIS standards, and there are 4 levels to the QRIS, and we are expecting that a setting meets level 3 of the QRIS. We expect that there is rigorous and consistent professional development and coaching being provided, and that the program is using program data and student outcomes for continuous improvement purposes. So when we did a scan of the city, we conducted a survey of about 200 community providers this summer. We followed this up with a handful of quality observations. We think that there is a 1,350 quality seat gap in Boston, 1,350. Quality seat gaps differ in Boston by neighborhood. So neighborhoods like Dorchester, Hyde Park, West Roxbury, East Boston, and Rosendale have among the highest quality seat gaps in the city. Neighborhoods like South Boston, Brighton, Charlestown, Austin, and JP either have negligible gaps or surpluses in quality seats. We think that the way to close these gaps on a neighborhood basis is by investing in both the expansion of BPS seats as well as community provider seats. In some neighborhoods, it will be the case that even if we expand BPS and expand currently high quality CBOs, we still won't meet the demand gap there. And so what we will have to do is take a look at the next tier of community-based providers who may be a couple of elements short of achieving our quality threshold and make investments in those organizations as well. So among the strategies that we are looking at, first is a set of citywide investments that need to be made because we do need to be concerned about investing in equitable ways. So we're looking at investing in equalizing teacher compensation. So if you are a BPS K-1 teacher, you make significantly more than a teacher in a CBO setting with equal credentials. If we do not start to close that gap, it will create certainly some labor market inequities, but could really be a barrier to establishing the citywide quality that we're looking for. We also want to make sure that we're assisting teachers to earn advanced credentials where they do not have a minimum BA and to provide tuition assistance in our community-based settings. We want to sustain the ground that we've gained through the pre-expansion grant program, which is our federal program. If we do not sustain this, then we lose about 700 quality seats in the city. And so that backs us up to a 2,000 seat gap if we don't sustain the work that we've already done. Again, we're looking at strategically expanding BPS seats, strategically expanding seats in community-based organizations, and investing in improving quality in community-based organizations that are just short of our quality threshold. Lastly, we're looking to establish a citywide oversight system for pre-K expansion in Boston. And right now, we are thinking that this is a partnership between City Hall, particularly my office, and the Early Education Department in Boston Public Schools. But this would be a governance unit that looks at the disbursement of funding and investment to community-based organizations, the expansion of BPS, as well as quality monitoring citywide.
Thank you very much, Ron. And Mary, is there anything, Mary McCoy, Revenue Manager, would you like to add to the discussion at this point?
That's fine.
Go ahead,
Counselor,
Dave.
if I could we just had one more slide.
Sure.
If people are interested in more information, we've been trying to put out some more information about some things we've filed and some impacts of some public policy issues. So we do have a Medium page under my name if people are interested in learning more about the comprehensive education finance reform proposal in its entirety.
You recognize this City Councilor Tim McCarthy. Any questions at this point, sir?
Mr. Chair, welcome. As always, just a couple questions. Let's just say this goes through, Treasurer Goldberg sets the money aside, we're ready to go. With 2,500 seats we'd be putting in for pre-K, where would they go as far as the building capacity? Because I know when I look at District 5, I know my schools very, very well. They're pretty packed. So are we waiting for the master plan still? How's that going to work?
So the master plan will inform some of this, but let's take one neighborhood scenario, not your neighborhood, but East Boston. So East Boston is a neighborhood where we know the footprint of public schools is very constrained. There we don't have many options for expanding buildings. We also know that we don't have very many operating CBOs in East Boston. So to the degree that we can eke out more seats through Boston Public Schools, we'll take a look at that. We need to think about what does the investment in those CBOs look like and how much more can they expand. I think preliminary data from our master plan analysis is telling us that East Boston may be one of the places that is a candidate for perhaps a new facility because we are so constrained. And so on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, we're going to have to look at, in relation to the master plan, how do we expand footprint for BPS, either through major upgrades or new school buildings, and whom are we working with from a CBO standpoint that is already providing great service and who can provide great service with additional investment. But we think that in every neighborhood where a gap exists, it's going to take the combination of investing in schools and community-based organizations.
Okay. Thank you. So just the clarification for especially the people who are watching, the CBOs, you're talking about Head Start, ABCD,
Head Start,
Boys and Girls
Nursery,
Club.
Boys and Girls Club, yes.
Okay.
YMCA.
Okay. And then the last thing, when you said there was actually a surplus of 7,900 pre-K seats in Boston, a lot of those come with a cost, like the Catholic schools would come with a cost.
That's right.
So the concern that, and you had mentioned your own concern, how would that work as far as I'm a teacher at the Boys and Girls Club, we have a pre-K, I'm making $37,000 a year because I work for the Boys and Girls Club. A pre-K teacher in Boston Public makes X. Is some of this money going to use to close that gap?
Yes. So we'd be looking at equalizing teacher compensation for equivalent degree status as well. We still have to think about the mechanisms by which to do this. I'm encouraged by Speaker DeLeo's recent statements that he also recognizes this gap and that this is a place where the state should perhaps step in and help through EEC or other means to close that gap. But it's important to achieve an equitable investment.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Could
Thank
I
you,
just,
Councilor.
you mind if I
Go ahead,
add,
Dave.
Counselor, just, so those are all really good and complicated questions that we're going to have to work through. And so I would just clarify that this particular piece of legislation would only get us the $16.5 million here. at which point we would need to set up a governance structure and work through the council to kind of tackle some of these issues that you're raising in the long term as well.
Collective bargaining issue, all that.
That's right.
Right, understood. Thank you, Chief.
And then the home rule petition would establish an early education fund. What, if any, feasibility studies have been done to sort of assess the long-term stability of that? And that probably goes to the question earlier about the ebbs and flows of maybe a surplus, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, we tracked we did a pretty thorough analysis of the revenues and expenditures of the convention center fund, and I think we took the most conservative approach possible in projecting out their ability to sustain the diversion of these funds.
Okay.
Certainly, there could have been a more aggressive stance that would have required us to sort of manage the ups and downs of the funds, but I think we feel pretty comfortable now. And those are two charges that have traditionally gone up and not down.
Okay. And then is there any other example of a home rule petition where the city requires or calls for the treasurer to sort of segregate the funds? Do we have anything we can point to that
I'm
we're
not
directing the treasurer to do that?
I'm not sure that we do have a model. I can tell you the rationale, though. The rationale for having the treasurer play a part is just to placate people who may have concerns about the convention center's ability to meet its debt service requirements if funds are diverted.
Mhm.
So we made a modification to our initial draft of our proposal that we had internally and put the treasurer in the middle of that to mitigate that risk that the
Okay.
convention center could be put in at some risk relative to its existing bonds.
Great. We've been rejoined by my colleague, City Councilor Mark Siomo, along with City Councilor Ayanna Presley. Any of my colleagues have any questions at this point? Councilor Frank Baker? Councilor Siomo? Chair recognizes City Councilor.
Apologize for having to step out.
Mark
And
Siomo.
if you cover this, I apologize. Simple question. How reliable is this revenue going to be, and how consistent is it going to be? Like, I know you mentioned the 16.5 is kind of where we're going, what we're going after. Is that consistent, like 16.5 recurring revenue, or?
It's been fairly consistent. So going back, I have in front of me the data from 2010 through 2016. The vehicle rental surcharge has grown from $9.6 million in 2010 to $13.8 million in 2016, and that's grown every year.
Mhm.
And I think that just generally speaking, we would expect that to continue to grow every year. The sightseeing surcharge has also grown from about 2 million to 2.7 million over that period of time, and has been on a similar trajectory with generally
Right.
going up every year. So it's not, the pace of growth isn't dramatic, but it's been heading in the right direction since the middle of the recession. So I
Right.
think we feel pretty good about those sources.
And this will go in the general fund regardless, but you're saying that the intention of the mayor and the administration is to kind of earmark this for education,
We would earmark it specifically for early education.
early education, right?
Chair recognizes City Councilor Frank Baker.
Yep. Good morning. Thank you guys for coming. Like Council Siomo, I apologize for stepping out. Probably going to ask questions that you just answered. It's 16.5 million is what the projected would come to us now. The convention center uses this for their bond issuing. What else do they use it for?
So the convention center fund, which is the fund through which most of the convention center's finances are run, is actually primarily made up of revenues that are not related to the operations of the convention center. It's actually charges that were enacted when the convention center legislation was passed in 97 and 98.
All these types of taxes, hotel taxes, and that sort of stuff.
Exactly. And these are two of those charges. And these two in particular are generated solely in Boston.
Yeah.
And we spoke a little bit about this, but traditionally what has happened is because of these extraneous surcharges that are unrelated to the operations of the convention center has built up a balance in its fund over time. And then when the balance has gotten high and the state has had trouble balancing its budget, the state has swept a portion of the balance of that fund to balance its
All
budget.
money that's generated in Boston.
Uh,
Well,
the total amount of the revenue in the convention center fund generated in Boston is between 85 and 90% from year to year.
mhm.
These two sources are generated exclusively in Boston, though. So what's happening is they're running up very large surpluses, and then it's being spread statewide, and
Yeah.
most of the revenue is being generated in Boston. So we believe they could sustain the diversion of these two particular sources and still run a surplus. And we've attempted to account for the possibility of expansion as well in the legislation. So if there's a decision to expand the convention center and the financing is necessary, if the revenues are necessary for financing that, this would allow for that as well.
So you mean they could go in and take it back?
Yes. Well,
And where would that leave us, though?
going forward, I mean,
Yeah.
they wouldn't come back and take money we had already spent, but we would have to sort of
Moving out a year or 2 years to say,
Exactly.
we're going to need to keep this on our books.
exactly.
Okay.
But I think our general philosophy on this is if the money, if a healthy surplus is being run up on revenues generated in Boston and being used for purposes that are unrelated to the convention center and unrelated to Boston, we have an equally strong claim on that revenue as well. And I should also add that with many legislative processes, with many pieces of legislation, it's a long process up at the State House, and we envision this potentially being a starting point for discussion about how to finance this. But we think it's a good creative starting point in that it doesn't raise taxes. It's an existing surcharge. It's really a Boston-centric charge, and it's for a stated need that I think there's a general consensus that we need to address, and that a lot of legwork has already been done on in the last couple of years.
And this needs to start here as a home rule, go up there, and what is the pushback? Well, obviously the pushback is they don't want to give us any money. Do we see this actually happening this year?
I think we're hopeful. We've received some feedback from Convention Center Fund. Obviously, the Convention Center has a lot of questions, but I think we're open to listening to us.
Yeah.
Same thing with the governor's administration. I think he called it publicly interesting idea that he would need to look into further. Ron referenced Speaker DeLeo coming up with his own early ed plan. So I think it's encouraging to think that there will be some action on
Yeah.
early ed, and
Yeah.
that this could be a part of that discussion.
Good. Thank you. Nice work. Thank you.
Thank you. He recognizes City Councilor Ayanna Presley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning.
Morning.
I just one question. Very much appreciate the opportunity to increase access, and also appreciate the underscoring of the need for that access to be quality. So in that vein, a constituency that we've been working with here, and we thank the Senate President for his leadership as well, is one of the ways that we ensure that those seats are quality and the education being provided is quality, is to stabilize that workforce. And so I'm just wondering if there's been any thought given to how we support the community-based providers in their educational and professional development.
A ton of thought has been put into this, and it has been primary among our considerations. So in addition to investing in the quality of individual centers, there are a set of citywide investments that we want to make. One, in teacher salary equalization, so that we make sure that you aren't making a disproportionate amount as a BPS teacher versus a CBO teacher.
Wonderful.
We also want to make sure that we are providing tuition assistance and incentives for teachers to get advanced degrees. So our quality threshold is a minimum BA level teacher in all settings. If there is a teacher in a community-based setting who does not have that, we want to provide the resources for that teacher to get that as well. We are exploring partnerships with some of our university and college partners to see if there might be some cost-sharing opportunities on that as well. And certainly we will need to rely on them for the educative component.
All right. I'll be following up offline.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Hard to be against pre-K for 4-year-olds citywide. I'll speak for all of my colleagues. So great work on your behalf. I think your fight is not clearly with the council. Your fight's going to be up at Beacon Hill trying to convince state reps and senators from across the Commonwealth that it makes sense for the city of Boston to tap into the surplus funds of the convention center. So I'll leave that up to you folks. As we transition now, if there's anyone here wishing to offer public testimony, now is the time to do so. Seeing and hearing no desire for public testimony from those that are in the gallery, I'll be concluding the hearing at this point with respect to docket 0181, message and order approving a home rule petition to the general court entitled "An Act Relative to Surcharges Imposed to Finance the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center," sponsored by Mayor Walsh. And at this time, the Committee on Government Operations is adjourned. Thank you.